We're going to look at a lot of code, but it's mostly JSON or PowerShell. And I'm going to explain why we've made a lot of the decisions that have got us this far. And yeah, that's a good summary of what we're going to cover. There is a session, I think tomorrow, where he's also going to go up on the DSC v3, but he's going to be more of a how-to write your own modules. And then Jeff Hicks has a session later in the week on basically DSC leading up to v3 and anybody who wanted to use it as it is shipped in Windows. So anything you want to learn about DSC this week, you probably can get out of a session. If not, just catch me in the hall and I'll explain anything you want. Okay, so I'll explain before I get to why that right now DSC v3 is in an alpha stage. We were hoping to be code complete by the end of March. We had a bunch of new work come in for other stuff, so we had to delay. We're really close. Out of the things I can demo today, I'll explain it as I go, but there's a few things that are working, but I know there's gonna be big changes coming, so I didn't fully finalize some of the adapter logic and stuff like that to get there. You'll see what I'm talking about as I go. But most of what you're gonna see today in demo is sitting in my PR for Steve Lee to review. So there could be more commits tomorrow. And so you'd want to build it off of my PR if you wanted to get the latest version. So you're literally seeing this work in progress. Cool thing about DSC v3 from almost the very beginning, there was very little that happened before. We're doing it open source from the very beginning. So you can see every commit, you can see the entire issues list. Even if you don't want to do the build and run the commands yourself, a lot of the stuff in the issues list can just use like +1 votes, like managing reboots. Yep, that's important. You know, +1 or leave a comment. That's a big deal. That helps us understand that we're working on the right things. So this is just the common location where we're managing the project. I think we can get to code complete within the next couple of weeks. And hopefully by PSConf EU, we'll be able to do a little bit more of an end-to-end story, and Steve Lee will be doing that demo. So let's start with why even do a v3? Like, isn't DSC dead? Do you do Twitter? So it's not, and we are using DSC all over the place at Microsoft. I want to show you one thing really cool that came out at Build. So if you have a Windows 11 machine and you type dev home, I don't know if PowerPoint will try to stay on top. So you might be asking, what the heck is this and why are you showing it to me? We are doing a lot of partner work with the developer division. This dev home concept, they came to us and said, hey, we're building like a developer dashboard for Windows 11. And one of the big things we're trying to figure out is, like, if you go look at a project in GitHub, how would you know that you're using the same tools as the people who are working on the project, so you kind of get continuity? So they had this idea of a machine configuration view. And one option is set up local machine, and you can come out here and pull it from a repository. If I hit cancel, I go back. And then there's install applications. I can go in here and say, I want PowerShell 7, I want VS Code, I want Windows Terminal, add to the list, hit next, finish, and it installs everything for me. And then there's this concept of configuration file, where you just browse for a YAML file, it ingests it, and then it basically just goes through the list and installs all the applications as if you had picked from here and did it that way. This is just using DSC. So this is a good example of what we're trying to accomplish by reaching out to tons of different partners within Microsoft to say, instead of trying to win all the hearts and minds to go and use DSC by authoring their own code, what can we deliver as a full end-to-end solution using supported resources where, quite frankly, like, the developer community doesn't have to go embrace DSC. They just get an experience that they wanted, and it uses DSC under the hood. So this is where we're seeing a tremendous amount of growth in DSC, and there's a bunch of other stuff going on in DevDiv. But across Azure, machine configuration is the service where there's unreal growth of DSC happening. And then obviously Azure Automation and the DSC extension still exists, and a handful of other places where we're still seeing it. One of the big things we wanted to do for DSC v3, V1, V2, as you all know, tightly coupled into Windows, including like the get DSC resource, start DSC configuration are tightly coupled into WMI. You've all seen like, oh, I didn't run WinRM quick config, so I can't do something. So we wanted to move to a completely native code implementation, but have PowerShell be the first thing we focus on for resources. So not rely on WMI, not rely on WinRM, be able to do something completely cross-platform without having to integrate with OMI, which isn't supported anymore for Linux, and be able to do more than we could before, but completely native code with full compatibility for the original set of resources. So we set our goals pretty high. We've had the idea for several years. What if we decoupled the way we run a resource and the resource itself? So we started thinking about this for machine config a few years ago that was like, well, instead of having people write just the PowerShell resource, what if we started with a JSON file that said forget, I always do that, it's not forget, it's for the get method, and then for the set method, and for the test method, tell me what executable you want to run, and then the arguments. So if it's PowerShell, tell me what version of PowerShell. And frankly, if you want to run a native command, or if you want to write your resources in Python, let's not stand in your way. You just give us a manifest, it says this is how to run it, and then you've got your automation artifact to the side. So that was a big part of the first idea was it should be easy to author, and then basically anything should be able to be used as a resource. And then we had the tons and tons of feedback on, you guys got to get rid of MOF, you got to like work towards a more cloud native solution and things like that. So this would be our ultimate goal. So this is a bicep file. I think we would land this first in JSON as an Azure Resource Manager template. We would work towards being able to do this natively in bicep and possibly even beyond that. And certainly we would want to extend this concept to other clouds, but I wanted to paint the picture. You can see I set the API version to 2029 just to indicate that this is not real. That is the day that I will turn 50, so that's the API version. The idea would be, if I deploy a VM in the cloud, I shouldn't have to take how I'm going to configure that machine and all the automation scripts that get me there and like put that somewhere else in a zip file that I have to figure out how to get access to and all that kind of stuff. I should be able to put that right in my configuration. Now, maybe I've got like some hugely complicated scenario and it still makes sense to push that out into a separate artifact that I manage independently. Could be. But if it's just a simple thing, I should be able to put that right into my deployment script and not have to think about all these different things happening. So you would see here that the idea would be in my assignment, I say that I want it to apply, I want it to autocorrect, maybe I put the timing and things like that in there as well. And then for the resource type, I'm going to everybody's old favorite, the file resource, and just saying, go create a file and put this text in it, right? And as simple as that is not easy to do today. After we've been trying to figure this out for how long? So that's the level of simplicity that's our goal to try to reach, to see if we can get there. So the majority of this session, I'm going to spend walking through this list. We're just going to go one by one. It's going to be boring if you don't like reading code. Not line by line. I just kind of pulled the snippets up to explain what are these things and how do they work so you can get a feel for what's new. If you have questions along the way, just raise your hand. I'll probably repeat them so they can hear them in the recording, and we'll just roll through it. So let's start with adapters. The idea of an adapter, I sorted these alphabetically, and I don't know if that makes sense chronologically or not, but here we go. The idea of an adapter is the JSON manifest that tells DSC what to go run. So you can see in this one, and the nice thing is if you go look at the project, there is a published schema definition for each of these concepts. So whenever you go into something like VS Code and you're doing the editing, IntelliSense just figures it out as you go. It says, oh, you're going to need these properties. Here's the validated set for each of these values and all that kind of stuff. So that works really well. So in this case, The adapter type is Microsoft.DSC, which is the namespace that we're going to reserve for the stuff that we're shipping in DSC v3, and it's /PowerShell. I also have one checked in for /Windows PowerShell, which means you can control both in the resource when you write it and when you call DSC, depending on how you want to do it, and tell it, I want you to run this in PowerShell 7 or PowerShell 5. Because as we've all seen, some stuff is different in 5 and 7. And even if it works in 7, it might be using implicit remoting, and the deserialization gets your output all screwed up. So the ability to say, I've got one config, and on an item-by-item basis, I want to tell DSC, use PowerShell 5 or use PowerShell 7, and give you that control as you go through it. So in this case, it's /PowerShell, so that's indicating 7. And then what you would see if you were to look, and we can go look at the GitHub repo if you'd like, but in this case, under the type adapter, as an example, this is the list operation. So when you run the equivalent of get-dsc resource, and it lists the available resources, what you're looking at is it's saying call pwsh, pass in these these arguments, and then run this script and pass it the parameter list. And that PS1 file is just a script that has, what you'll see in v3 is in addition to get, set, test, we also have list, validate, and export, which we'll get into. But list is the operation that says, I want to return all the things that this thing knows, so guess what it runs? Get DSC resource. And if it runs it in 7, you get one list, and if it runs it in 5, you get a different list. And we control that by looking at the properties of the module that says, what editions of PowerShell do you support? So there's all kinds of things that we can do to build upon this and make it super, super powerful. I think I have 2 slides on this. I do, good, okay. The other part of adapters, besides solving PowerShell versioning, is the concept that anything should be able to express itself as a resource. Our hypothesis is that from about now going forward, most command line tools have the option to express JSON as the output format. And you've seen that in like kubectl and AZCLI and the Amazon resource. Like everything has -- format or -- JSON as a way to say output to JSON. Well, in DSC v3, we needed, because it's not running a PowerShell commandlet where you can pass objects down the pipeline, we needed a way to standardize input-output between the dsc.exe executable, which is written in Rust, and everything else in the world. So we just standardized on JSON. So it's receiving JSON as input to DSC that gets fed into the parameters of the resource, and the resource feeds JSON back out, which is great for PowerShell because PowerShell is awesome at working with JSON. It feeds that JSON back out, DSC interprets it, and knows how to handle the orchestration. In this case, what I was playing around with, failed miserably, I'm going to submit a PR and figure out how we can do this, was, okay, well, there's a command in Windows called date. What if I just wanted to do DSC resource get and have it return the date of the current machine? And you'll see a little bit why that might be interesting. It's, yes, that would be a problem, but that's not the actual bug. It's because date doesn't return JSON. So I'm going to have to, we've got a bunch of ideas on how we could do this. One would be maybe we just need an adapter for CMD. I would find that really like satire and probably use it for demos to have an adapter that says, here's how you run batch files. And we could just echo out a JSON wrapper for whatever these things implement. If there's a need for that, this is so adaptable we could do it. And that's kind of what makes it cool. It's more likely what we'll do is some sort of like a generic capture that says, have a property that's like wrap with simple JSON equals true, and we'll just take whatever the output is and do result equals and capture the string output. So a bunch of ways we can figure this out. We'll ask for feedback, see what the right way to do it is. But the reason I wanted to present this was to say, there's a bunch of things out there that might not even need PowerShell resources. So there's a great demo happening tomorrow where he's using tzutil.exe, and he just wrote a wrapper that handles the JSON input-output and did a time zone utility and never wrote any script. He's literally just calling tzutil.exe and handling the input-output. That's the idea of it should be simple enough that anybody can do it without being intimidated, and it should be flexible enough that anything can be a resource. And then I think we would get more people who are doing cloud deployments to consider it as an option, because the hurdle, what you all probably have experienced, is like, how the heck do I even get started writing a resource? And then everybody uses the script resource. And the next adapter that I've done PowerShell, I've done Windows PowerShell. The next one I'm going to work on is just a script adapter. So what that would look like is get, call PWSH or PowerShell DXC, depending, and just run get.ps1. And then set would be mapped to set.ps1. And the idea was kind of like in the script resource, where you copy and paste your script into get script, set script, test script. And then you have all the problems. Well, it's not signed. And then how do I write unit tests? Because these aren't like atomic scripts and things like that. If we can move those out to just standalone scripts, then we get the flexibility we want, we get the simplicity we want, and also we could do that in Bash, we could do that in Python, we could do that in Go. We don't really care at that point. It's just run that script at the. In fact, if you wanted to have a funny adapter that said, I want get to run PowerShell and set to run Bash and test to run Python, it shouldn't really matter. That's the level of abstraction that we're kind of going for. So that is adapters. Any thoughts or questions about adapters before I move on from that? Yes, sir? Does it replace a resource? It becomes the glue between DSC.exe and the resource. So it itself is a resource that just enables nested resources, would be the way to think about it. Sure? Would people be able to write their own adapters? Yes. The question was, would people be able to write their own adapters? And 100%, yeah. That's the way we're thinking about it. In fact, we're not playing around. This sounds funny. We're partnering very closely with several teams. One of them is the Power Toys team. They've been looking at, could they recommend a best practice where things like setting in Windows actually are pre-built executables intended for this purpose. So they know they have to output JSON. They know they're going to have a simple set of parameters. They've got DSC resources out there now, I think. Hopefully I'm not stealing their thunder, but if I am, Clint will forgive me. But that's the idea, is we would like to find more people to partner with that are thinking upstream a little bit, to saying, instead of having an application and then a PowerShell resource that wraps the configuration of your application, why don't you just build that configuration capability right into your application? So be able to run thing.exe space config space whatever and have that manage the settings. Will we ever get there completely? Absolutely not. That's a lofty, lofty goal. But if we can capture some hearts and minds and kind of get that pattern rolling, I think that would be a really, really simple way to handle things. So assertions. The concept of assertions, once you get this, it's like the simplest thing, but it's totally lacking from DSC v2. So the idea was, for assertions, what if before I have my resource run set, I just want to check to see what this environment looks like. And it's literally just a check. So I want to assert that I am on server 2019 and later. Or, so imagine you've got one configuration script and you say, do these steps if you're on 2019 and later, but these other steps if you're on 2019 and newer. I don't know if I got that right, but before or after, right? Before, you had to sort that out in your PowerShell script so that at compile time, it would figure out what version of Windows am I running on and produce the right MOF file. The goal is to just have one JSON or YAML file where you tell it, if you're on this OS, do this. If you're on this OS, do that. An assertion really is just a resource. It's just that you're telling DSC a different way to use that resource. Tricky thing is going to be, it's not really tricky, but an evolution that we're going to have to work out is really, honestly, like in V1, we didn't even use get. And in V2, we barely used get. So a lot of the resources that are out there, get is not super well implemented. So I imagine that most of the things used for assertions are going to be new-ish resources, because we'll spend more time telling it how to have the get method return the right level of detail so that you can have an assertion that's reliable. Because a lot of the time, I mean, I know I was guilty of this too when we were first doing DSC resources. It's like, well, If we're only using set and test and get is just like for decoration, then fine, just put something in there. Right? So the idea here that you're seeing on the screen is first there's an assertion here, which is calling the assertion adapter, which knows I don't care about set or tests. Well, actually, I only care about tests, sorry, which is going to rely on get in some cases. Go check the registry, see if system root is on a Z drive. If it is, then set this example to present, is the workflow we're looking at there. Export largely came from M365 DSC. So if you've seen that, M365 DSC was originally developed by the Microsoft field as a way to say somebody wants to test something in SharePoint. So let's run a script that uses DSC and runs get across known things in a SharePoint farm, pulls them all out, creates a configuration script, and then I can go offline where there's no impact, deploy that same SharePoint farm, run all my tests. When I get it right, then I can bring it back to production. So it's like cloning. And what they discovered is that it works really well if you know exactly how to build the thing that you're trying to clone. So the problem is SharePoint's a good example. I need to install Windows. I need to join it to a domain. I need to install SQL. I need to install these dependent things. Then I can set up my farm. Then I can set up the sites. Like all that stuff has to happen chronologically. They definitely have expressed requirements and are pushing us on this, which is great. It's exactly what we need to say, I need an export capability. Nick's actually been asking for this for like years. He's always said we need a fourth method called export. So get, set, test, export. The first place where we'll do this, if you remember like the dev home thing, would be, can we just look at stuff like winget, because winget already has a DSC resource, and say, for this resource type, go find all of the known entities and return that as a config. So if it'll work really well for something like package. We've got a package manager. We know how to call it. That thing can output a full list of what's installed on this machine if it knows about it, right? So you could say export type, and then you tell it your package manager or additional, what websites are configured in IIS, stuff like that. It's a known thing. And you could say, okay, all those things. What you wouldn't want to do is export the file resource. That would not make any sense at all. Like, give me a configuration that would replace every single file across this operating system, or registry, or WMI. That would be horrible. Like your script would never stop getting generated, right? So there's things that are just naturally not gonna fit. Now, there probably is a thing that's more like, I want to export these 100 files. They're, the details of where they're stored and their contents, because then I can duplicate something that's on a machine to somewhere else. So some of those scenarios might start to make sense. And in that case, we would need more than just export type. We would need export type with some details about specifics. So we're still working through that. But you get the idea that this is a real scenario. It's exposed in DSC.exe today, and it'll actually be the next part of the PowerShell adapters that I'm helping work on. Functions. If you've written an ARM template, you have seen functions already. In fact, a lot of you probably have seen this in JSON in general, and this was super hard to do in V1 and V2, and it was a really common request. And so I'll explain how to do it, and then I'll explain the scenario that makes sense. So in this example, you're saying, I just want to write the output of what operating system am I running. So for the resource, it's OS info, and it's running the test, and you can see under output, the output of the echo resource, so it's just running the echo command, is referring back to the OS info resource above it. I guess I could use my mouse cursor. So the echo command, it would have to be implemented in the resource, is first calling OS info, looking at its output, and it's saying, when you write the output, concatenate this string. The OS is refer back to the OS property coming from Microsoft /OS info. and then go get actual state.family. So actual state.family would be downstream properties of the OS value returned by the OS info resource. That seems like you're just doing a lot of string parsing. The actual scenario for this kind of stuff is like, I'm going to deploy a database. I don't know the connection string to that database until after it's deployed. Then I can deploy my web server. And when I deploy my web server, I can tell that website how to talk back to SQL. But I don't know what that is until it's generated. And people have asked for years, can you have one resource output to the next? And they're like, nope. This is like it sent them off. It does this, 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 this. So this concept of functions through the ideas like string parsing and capturing output and being able to refer to output and bring it forward really starts to fulfill that data flow input output across resources. Right now this works, I'll get to groups next, I think. Within groups, and then one group can refer to the next. We're looking at like being able to do nested reference calls up and down the stack and stuff like that as we go through configurations.
So,
yeah.
Can I just ask, because this reminds me, this is giving me trauma associated with ARM.json.
Yeah, I get it.
Are we really going to go back to programming in data languages? Because that sucks. I'm sorry, like, why can you just give me a way to call that thing in a PowerShell script and let me write a PowerShell script instead of writing a YAML file with script in it?
We need some way to refer back to the previous
Sure.
output.
So give me the ability to use that, like you got a
Oh, just as input?
And pass that object into.
Just take the whole JSON?
Give it to me as an object or give it to me as JSON.
What if we, for maybe it's just a bad example, like what if a parameter input for this one was literally just reference resource ID property thing? And kind of take the string concatenation out of it.
Make it less, like I said, the problem with ARM.json, the reason why we have bicep is because debugging this is impossible.
That's an interesting one. Okay.
You can't breakpoint on it, you can't inspect it. All you can see is output. And so you end up writing 14 lines of different output to see what everything is so that you can tell what went wrong. Why did I not get what I thought I was going to get? It becomes imperative then as well, not declarative. Yeah, I mean, this is
that's a really tricky part. Yeah. Whenever you flow output to input, Murawski and I sat and argued about this at camp one time, and his opinion was, as long as you always get the same outcome, it's still declarative. I don't know. I'm probably in the middle somewhere. I think this is a good one. I'll create an issue on this and tag you in it because we should keep that going.
JSON is for machines, seriously, but like again and again and again, like no one likes to write JSON files.
Well, this is technically YAML. I follow you, yeah. I follow you. Yeah. I follow you.
Immediately I have that flashback of like the bad days of when people started promoting JSON as the best way to write templates for Azure. And then we need a couple of years that they figured out that that's not really the good thing. Let's go with the bicep, right?
Yeah.
So now we have a bicep, but then here with the syntax, I have a feeling that we're going back to where we were with the JSON templates, and that's not good.
Is the issue flowing across resources or just the language?
For me, it's two things. One is that you've embedded code in a string, which
that I could clean out.
Right?
I just pulled this because it was our pester example.
Yeah, no, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's code in a string, that's one problem.
Yeah.
And then because I'm making inferences about how this is going to run, I assume that I'm never going to be able to inspect the state at the point in time when that string.
That's the hard part. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that if you provide authoring mechanism that I cannot look at this,
that's right.
Do something nice and
you can't.
It's going to be created like this behind the scenes. I don't care.
You can't see it in source code. Yeah.
I didn't care before for MOV files.
Yeah.
Because MOV files are for machines as well, right? No one expect me to open empty notepad and start writing MOV files.
That's right.
That's how I feel about JSON file.
If you
Seriously, I'm
Hold on, let me go over here and come back.
I just want to jump on board as well and say that Bicep has really solved this problem so well in the last 4 years.
That's my next question. Yeah.
I was just
Should we do have a bicep
maybe
extension?
like a right bicep instead of this.
Okay.
In fact, I would suspect that if you ship this, somebody's gonna make a way to write bicep.
Yeah. Yeah, we've sat down with their team. We just got to build the extension to make it work. That's really good feedback. Yes, sir.
I feel like I'm gonna sound stupid for saying this, but I'm stuck in DSC V1, and I just now in this comment learned that. So this is the resource how you write it now. It's
This
not
is the
PowerShell anymore?
this would be the config.
Yeah, but like actually how you would be
Yeah.
sitting and writing it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So you can actually write it in YAML or JSON, either one. It doesn't really matter. And we
Describing a whole environment or infrastructure like this is going to be like 10,000 lines. It's just way too much to describe like
Okay.
a working environment compared to something like Bicep, which has the ability to like have a parameter file
yeah.
and loop through really nicely and do some logic already, like it's already in the language.
Yeah.
So
We also do handle parameters, but I think I'm following you on a different.
I just want to be able to take a file.
Yeah.
And like just take it to another place and deploy it there.
So your
Clean definition, like from the user interface, that file with arrays of clean hash tables.
Yep.
That describes my whole environment so well.
Yep.
I can put it in source control and copy and paste like objects that represents a database or a file system or interactions between different components.
That's a good one you should explore too. So we are supporting parameter files in the same way that like for ARM deployments, you can do a parameter file separate from your deployment file. That might help with the readability of passing from one resource to another because you could go back and look at the data file. But still, let's start an issue in GitHub because I don't want to lose the feedback we're getting here, but also as we all have more time to chew on it, we'll take it further than just what we can answer here. But I want to get your GitHub ID before I leave so I can tag you in that or at least send it to you. Groups is a similar concept, so I'm curious on your feedback. Not similar concept, but the idea was I need to keep a set of resources together. So I've got these things can happen and these things can happen. Before, we've always had those complicated depends on statements. That's like this one depends on these three, and then the second one depends on just the bottom two and those kind of relationships. The concept of a group started with these three need to run. They can have dependencies within themselves, but like not until that whole group finishes should this other set of resources run. And it could be an individual resource depends on the group or a group depends upon a group. As we've come along, we've started finding more and more scenarios to the point where it'll often come up like with a new challenge. Can we solve this? And we've just said, actually, I think I can do that as a creative use of a group instead of needing a new capability in DSC. And so you'll see some examples of that. But a group is just another resource type that knows a special capability, which is to associate a list of resources. Which takes me to this one, which is one of the group types is parallel. So I could say, here's 4 resources, go run those in parallel. Once that group finishes, now I can move on to group 2, which needs to happen in order. So that's an idea of introducing a different type of grouping that solves a unique problem. Yes, sir?
Should that be built in the engine in a way how it works also for the Bicep when it runs resources in parallel by default? But if you need an order, then you build implicit or explicit dependencies. Why do I need to care about parallelism and then group things that I don't want to be like that? Like, I mean, I have a feeling that you are kind of discovering the wheel again when we have something that already behaves that way.
Could be.
And why do we have then different things bicep that kind of solve that
Could be.
in an elegant way, fixing things that were existing with JSON with a syntax that was wrong, or not wrong, but just like convoluted.
So you would rather have the expression of parallel or not parallel just basically be like a global property?
Just depends on.
Just depends on. So if it doesn't have a dependency, it can go ahead and run.
In the engine itself, like
That's the way bicep works.
If I don't have any dependencies, you run things in parallel.
And then we're
This is how it works with the bicep, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Will be grouped in a module if we want to run them like together or depend on a whole series of.
I don't see any reason why we couldn't. I mean, I could test this now just using the parallel group. So I don't see any really reason why, if that's a cleaner model, we couldn't explore
I'm just
not needing the group.
I see a kind of a parallelism between how Azure resources are deployed with the bicep and how this will work with resources. This is just Azure resources.
Yeah.
We have lots of different resources.
I like that.
But the behavior should be the same.
The same as the way the ARM engine works. Yeah.
No need to kind of recreate something and
I like that.
things are already there somehow, right? I don't know, things
Yeah.
that you can reuse
Yeah.
completely their code, but like the concept should be the same thing. Like if I don't have any dependencies being implicit or explicit, then run things in parallel. This is what it's
I like that.
right?
Yeah.
If I need to have that, then I will specify dependencies
Okay.
in the same way as I
Okay.
do with bicep.
I will also create an issue for that.
I mean, the thing is that if we have already a lot of people writing bicep files or ARM templates in general, right? Why they need now to relearn things just for doing this? Wouldn't it be better that they can just reuse the knowledge they already have and expectations that they have for deploying bicep, authoring bicep, kind of apply to this as well?
I think the real value of where you're getting to is the behavior of the ARM engine, like the bicep expression as a language. We could adopt that, right? I think the real argument you're getting to is have it behave like Azure Core when it handles deployments, not in a way that's different, or else your expectation is going to be off when you're trying it for the first time. Okay, that's cool. That's really good feedback. Pre-test, and this will be a good one for feedback too. We have the concept of, okay, in DSC v1 and v2, if test fails, you run set. We have a concept of being able to turn that off. So we can say implements pre-test false, which tells the engine you don't have to run test before you run set. This is an anomaly. I just always want you to run set no matter what. There's some scenarios that have come up where that was needed. So we added it. Not as big of a reaction for that one. The schema is an extension. So whenever you, remember we've always had schema.moth, and in your resource that you wrote, if it was script-based, if it was class-based, your schema was your parameters for your class. If you're script-based, then you had the schema.moth. It was a moth file that said, these are the available properties for that resource. Here's their description, here's their type. The idea is if you're describing a resource as a JSON manifest, at the end of it, so this is like scrolling down to the bottom, there's an expressed schema that says, here's the additional properties for the resource. So here's the list of parameters that are being input, their type. Is it expected to support or output any properties that are not listed here for flexibility, and additional metadata that will continue to grow over time. The whole point of this basically is to get rid of the schema.moth file that was accompanying those resources and just have that expressed in the same manifest that tells it what to run and how. Almost out of time, but we're close. One of the things we're looking at, because there's a bunch of scenarios now, especially in the developer type scenarios, where it needs to be invoked in the user context instead of in the system context. So instead of running a system where you've got root access and you can do anything you want, if you're running as a user because you want it to to interop with your local desktop, and you want it to go install applications or change some Windows settings and things like that. Now your context has changed. Now we got to deal with UAC. So the whole idea of having a security context section in the metadata was within your configuration, and even more granular if needed. You should be able to say, run this normal user context, now elevate, run in this user context, and then we'll have to figure out like what's the user experience during that. So is it like running and then it prompts UAC and you approve and then it goes back to running, and then, because there's actually some applications that can't run in UAC, we found, their installers. So this will be interesting to work through, but it's a completely new idea. And then timeout, we kind of had this before in the extension for DSC, but this is just the basic section in the metadata that says for this config or for this group or for this resource, if it runs more than this number of seconds, then kill it, so the machine doesn't just sit there and turn forever in some loop. Just give it a basic timeout operation. So I know we're about out of time. The two demos I wanted to show just to show compatibility. And like Steven said, the great thing about predictors is you just pull them right up in history. So this is just an example of, it's basically invoke DSC resource, but it would be calling DSC resource get. And it's specifying, so DSC resource get, I should run dsc.exe first, and let's take a look at the overall experience. But it's telling it to call PS desired state configuration /file. It was just saying there's a destination path, go look for c:/test.txt, and then there's the normal file input. And the real difference here was in V2, file didn't work at all. Yes, sir? Yes, and binary. So that's the big thing that I was showing here, is that right now, those are the three types that I have expressed for PowerShell. So binary only works for the Windows PowerShell because I'm running it in 5. Class and MOF or script both work in.
So that was the file binary resource.
Yes. And then the other one was everybody's favorite and the one they hate the most, which was the original script resource. So in this case, my get script is just running get content for that same file. I didn't bother implementing set or test. And I'm just telling it to go ahead and run DSC resource get, but output JSON. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, in fact, I should be able to.
Is this the version of the Rust, like current Rust engine that's being worked on?
Yep, you got it. Yep.
Is it possible to see that version? Like, is there
Yes. In fact, let me run another tab. Oh. I'll come back to that. So if I just run the DSC executable, that's what the output looks like. This is the most current build as of this morning. And so you can see it can generate a completion script. So in PowerShell, you could do tab completion by registering that as an autocompleter. This is how you would pass it in. So you can say DSC config. And you can actually run, even for a configuration, get set test. The last one I'll show here. And then we'll follow up in GitHub or in the community call or whatever. So this was using Rust. It's calling basically get DSC resource. A couple of the things you'll see that are interesting here. So first of all, obviously, all of the original resources there, including file, log, and signature validation that are binary type. But there's this new column, which is capabilities, expressed here as caps to make it shorter for the column. So GST is get, set, test. And if it supports exports, if it supports validate, that kind of stuff, it actually is an expression for the capability. So the way I've got it now is for all of the original stuff in the gallery, it just defaults to get, set, and test. But if you want to publish a new resource tomorrow that only implements get and test because you only care about audits, you could actually see that as you're going through your list of resources. So we're out of time, but I'll come over to you. Oh, yeah.